I am not a person who gets scared easily. I have read, heard, and even created several horror stories, but what I am going to tell you now is something that really happened to me and that, to this day, makes me question what is real and what is not. It was a Friday night, and I was driving back home after a long week of work. I had spent the whole day in a small town in the countryside, where I had gone to a meeting that lasted longer than expected. It was already past 11 at night when I finally got on the road to go home. The highway I was traveling on was one of those deserted roads that cut through the countryside of the United States, where the only sign of life are the rusty speed limit signs and, occasionally, the glowing eyes of an animal crossing the road. There was no other car in sight, and the only company I had was the low music playing on the radio and the constant sound of tires on the asphalt. After about 30 minutes of driving, I noticed that the road was starting to get shrouded in thick fog. It wasn't unusual in this area, especially at night, but there was something strange about this fog. It felt almost solid, like it was trying to swallow me. I felt a little nervous, but I kept driving, trying to focus on the road. That's when I saw something in the distance, on the side of the road. It looked like a person, walking slowly, with a flashlight in hand. I approached, trying to identify who could be there, in the middle of nowhere, at such a time. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a white dress that seemed to shine in the headlights, and her long hair was loose, falling over her shoulders. I slowed down and rolled down the car window, ready to ask if she needed help. But before I could say anything, she looked straight at me. Her eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They were completely black, without any shine or reflection. A chill ran down my spine, and my mind screamed at me to get out of there as quickly as possible. Without thinking twice, I sped up and passed her. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that took my breath away. She was no longer on the side of the road. She was standing in the middle of the road, staring at the car as it drove away. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. I was in shock. My thoughts were racing, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Was it just my imagination? A trick of my tired mind? I tried to convince myself of this, but something inside me knew that it was not just an illusion. I kept driving, adrenaline now coursing through my body. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping to see her again, but the road behind me was empty. What frightened me most was the silence. There was no sound except the car engine. The music had stopped playing, and the radio was only emitting a soft hiss. About 20 minutes later, I started to feel calmer. I convinced myself that it was all just a hallucination caused by fatigue. But suddenly, the car started to fail. The lights on the dashboard flashed, and the engine sputtered. The car started to lose speed, until it finally stopped completely. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fog, and the car simply died. I tried to start the car again, but nothing happened. The engine gave no sign of life. I grabbed my cell phone to call the insurance company, but of course, there was no signal. I started to panic. Something inside me told me that I shouldn't get out of the car, that I was safer inside. But at the same time, I knew that I couldn't just stand there in the middle of that road. I decided to get out of the car to see if there was any obvious problem with the engine, something I could fix. I carefully opened the door and, as I stepped outside, felt a cold wind blow past me, biting like ice. I forced myself to keep going and open the hood, but the darkness and fog made it impossible to see anything. That was when I heard the noise. A low, dragging sound, like something was being pulled across the asphalt. I turned quickly, expecting to see an animal or, God forbid, that woman again. But there was nothing, just the empty road shrouded in fog. But the sound continued. It seemed to be getting closer, louder and louder. I looked around, desperate to find the source, but all I saw was darkness. The sound was now so close that it seemed to be right next to me, but there was nothing there. In a panic, I ran back to the car and locked myself inside. The sound of my heart beating was deafening, and I could feel cold sweat running down my face. My eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, waiting to see something emerge from the fog. That was when I noticed something strange. The fog seemed to be moving, as if it had a life of its own. It began to gather, forming itself into shapes I couldn't quite make out. And then, out of the mist, a figure emerged. It was the same woman from before, but now she was different. Her face was distorted, as if it had been stretched and twisted. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and her black eyes seemed to bore into me. I was paralyzed, unable to look away as she approached the car. She stopped right in front of the hood, and for a moment, everything was silent again. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Then, suddenly, the radio came to life, letting out a loud, distorted hiss. The woman's figure began to fade, as if it were being sucked back into the mist, until it disappeared completely. As soon as she was gone, the car's engine started up again on its own. Without a second thought, I slammed on the gas and drove away as fast as I could. The fog began to lift, and within minutes, I was back on a more familiar part of the road. When I finally got home, I was still shaking. I parked the car in the garage and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I knew I had witnessed something that defied logic and reason, something I could never explain. Since that night, I have avoided driving on deserted roads at night as much as possible. I don't know what it was that I saw, but one thing is for sure, there are things in this world that we simply don't understand, and maybe that's for the best. To this day, when I think about that experience, I feel that same chill run down my spine. And every time I drive down a foggy road, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, hoping to see those black eyes one more time. To this day, when I think about that experience, I feel that same chill run down my spine. And every time I drive down a foggy road, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, hoping to see those black eyes one more time.